Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World, where every world matters. My name is Diana Skaya. Donald Tusk recently unveiled the Polish government's new migration strategy during a meeting in Brussels. Now, one of the most contentious aspects of the proposal involves significant changes to Poland's asylum regulations. And following Finland's lead, Poland is now tightening its migration policies. But what does this mean for the future of migration in the EU? And could we be witnessing the transformation of the European Union, essentially closed off to migrants? Now, to discuss this, I'm pleased to welcome our guest, Loren Landau, Professor of Migration and Development at the University of Oxford. Good evening, sir. So thank you so much for being with us here on World Talks on TVP World.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Sir, so, let me ask you this. So Poland's new migration strategy follows here Finland's example in tightening migration policies. Do you believe that this actually signals a broader shift across Europe? I mean, why is this happening right now?
I think this is the next step in what has been a many-stage process since 2015 of Europe trying to stop migration in, particularly from poor countries and now from the East. This is just the next step. I think it does represent a significant closure of the borders. I think the moves to try to move more processing from countries into other countries, whether it's Uganda or Albania, suggest a next level of controls.
I mean, you just mentioned Albania. Now, I mean, this is a model, of course, developed by Italy, right, that has said that they will send immigrants to camps in Albania until their applications are fully processed. Is this going to really be a further model for European countries? And what can you tell us about this model exactly?
I think this effort of trying to process refugees and asylum offshore is something that we've seen from the United States. We've seen the UK try to do it with Rwanda. We are now seeing, I believe it's Spain or trying to do it with Senegal. So this is becoming the model, and I think it's connected to domestic politics in Europe, where whether you're on the left or the right of the political spectrum, it is important that you are seen as doing something to stop migration. So there is this, but it's combined with deals with Tunisia, it's combined with deals with Niger, all to try to create a border that exists outside of the European Union.
Okay, but what are some of the challenges that can come out of this exactly for this type of procedures?
There are obviously challenges for migrants and protecting migrant rights, but there's also challenges for Europe in the sense that these are extraordinarily expensive. They do put Europe in conversations and often in deals with countries and leaders like in Tunisia, which are undemocratic. But it also will not stop migration in the sense that people will continue to come in, but there will be more trafficking, there will be more smuggling, more people living underground, which raises broader questions of enforcement, what it does to the labor market, and also whether Europe can actually get the labor supply it needs to meet its needs with all of these controls in place.
I mean, what you're saying sounds almost twofold now, but why can't European countries handle sending back unwanted migrants? And essentially, it's very difficult to also be saying this, I mean, in 2024, but it is the reality that we're experiencing.
Yeah, I think part of the issue is that once they're within the European Union, there are a set of rules and regulations that govern what individual states can do in terms of repatriation, in terms of deportation. Countries also, once people are in, it's easier to move within, so some of the enforcement becomes more difficult. So I think these are strategies that are really an effort to keep people out of the EU, where the laws and the protections that exist within the EU won't apply. This is intended to make things easier, to make things simpler. Of course, it's not really a long-term solution.
So what do you see as a long-term solution, if you can just delve deeper into that?
Right. I think what's needed is really a kind of objective look at what migration is doing to Europe, what are the migration numbers, and what are the options. Europe needs to confront its own principles of being committed to rule of law, committed to human rights, committed to also free movement within the European Union. And how can it deal with this? And I think what we're seeing is a kind of strong emotional reaction, a symbolic effort to try to stop people from coming in, particularly people who are black and brown, but also people who might be coming from other regions. And what we need to say is, okay, in the long term, what does Europe need? What do people need? What are our obligations? And to try to be more pragmatic. Right now, what we see is performance, which will be expensive and result in human rights violations, but will ultimately not manage migration in a way that meets labor needs, that meets humanitarian commitment.
All right, so you're just talking about the humanitarian aspect here. Now, what might this mean for the EU's international image regarding this and humanitarian obligations, particularly in light of the wars that are happening right now? I mean, we still have the Ukraine conflict on one side, but then in the Middle East, we have the Israeli and war in the Gaza Strip that will also most likely cause a new wave of refugee influx, a possible refugee influx into Europe. So what can you say about this?
Well, I think what Europe is doing is, in fact, is eroding its moral sort of reputation around the world, its ability to speak about human rights. It will continue to give money, of course, for humanitarian efforts, whether it's in Gaza or Sudan or elsewhere in the world. But Europe as a sort of force for good, as being seen as something that is a leading light, that is committed to humanitarian principles and human rights, is definitely being eroded. That's not started now. That started really in 2015, 2016, with the upscaling of the externalization efforts of making deals with the leaders of Sudan and other countries to try to stop migration. But I think this really does hurt Europe overseas, and it will not keep as many people safe. Although, of course, most people are staying within Africa, within the Middle East, within Asia. Most people are not trying to come to Europe, and we do need to also find ways of supporting them.
What would you say, if I can ask you, as one of the biggest reasons? I mean, we saw just a while back, I mean, Germany also reintroduced its border controls for citizens. I mean, it was very spoken out about. Now, what about, I mean, what about, how is that going to look like? As I mean, we have the Schengen, right? Is this going to change the entire system, I mean, of what the values of the Schengen zone?
Well, I think that has already happened. Obviously, what Germany has done is a step in that direction of eroding. But we've seen from Hungary, when the UK was never part of Schengen, but its own policies, we're seeing different countries taking different approaches, whether it's patrolling their internal borders or the kind of deals that they're making to control the Mediterranean or their borders to the east. We're seeing your country, we're seeing Poland making certain types of statements about migrants coming in from Ukraine and elsewhere. There is obviously some discord, some disconnection between how the different countries want to do this. They are facing domestic political pressures, some of which will be much more anti immigrant than others. But we are definitely seeing a move across many countries, whether it's the Netherlands, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Hungary, to try to deal with this in a much more extreme way. And it does raise the question of whether the Schengen area will survive.
So, but before I ask you just to elaborate on that, I mean, what do you think? And I understand it may be a difficult question to answer, but why is this coming all of a sudden now, this year, beginning from Germany, and now suddenly Poland really taking a stance on this? Why is this happening now, this tightening on migration?
Well, it has definitely been a step up, but it's not happening all of a sudden. Since 2015, I think we have seen a slow rise in efforts to control the borders of Europe, to control its external borders, and to move those borders further and further away. I think what's really driving this right now is the economic uncertainty of the last 3 or 4 years, where many populations are struggling with inflation, with unemployment, with inequality. And it's also the rise of the right or right leaning parties in Europe who have made their careers, who have made their promises to people to address this issue. And either whether it's for the right, they're meeting their commitments, or parties on the left who feel that in order to stay in power or to gain party power, they must also be seen as controlling immigrants. So I think it's a number of different factors that have led up to this point. But now there is a sort of widespread agreement across Europe that something must happen. And these, what might be seen as quite extreme measures, are now being put in place.
Now, you're saying that something might happen, but now how likely is it that the European Union is going to implement comprehensive reforms on migration in the near future? And I mean, if you say that those reforms will be implemented, what do you think they would need to prioritize in order to balance out? I mean, we have topics like the humanitarian aspect, the economic aspect, like you mentioned, also the security aspect.
Right. I think what we really need to do is start from a position which is not one of fear, the fear that foreigners are coming in, that they're eroding our societies, they're stealing our jobs, but rather from a position of 5 years out, 10 years out, 30 years out. What is it that Europe wants to be like? What are we going to need in terms of labor force? What are we going to need in terms of where people are going to be? And to think about how we achieve those. What we're doing now is a kind of reaction. Is it out of fear, out of symbolic politics to just say, it's too much. It's too much. It is too much for certain communities in certain places. The total numbers are often not that great. If those people can be moved around, what are the domestic strategies that can be used for that? And how does Europe continue to maintain its commitments to humanitarian principles? These are all complicated discussions, and they're difficult to have when there's such political pressure to close the border and to close the border now. And I think those political pressures are what are driving policy at the moment.
Thank you so much, Sir Loren Landau, Professor of Migration and Development at the University of Oxford, for all your insights and input here on World Talks on TVP World.
Thank you.
Have a good evening. Thank you so much. And that's all for this edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm Diana Skaya. Up next, more news.